teeny tiny dungeon crawler Carl and grand champion breed winner regional national winner Princess Donut the Queen and Chunk. In this case, however, rather than being trapped in the world dungeon, they're trapped in a tiny video game of the world dungeon. I figured the Syndicate probably makes video games of the crawls, and what's cuter than a teeny tiny apocalypse? Off with these two wooden boxes because you gotta start somewhere, and our teeny tiny game console needs a basic structure. The idea here is that we'll build the outside of the game on the outside, and then add Carl and Donut running for their lives through the dungeon on the inside like a clip of a video game, inspired by the front cover art on the first Dungeon Crawler Carl book. Like the outside though, we need to add just a little bit of structure to the inside so we know where to place the hinges. So let's pop some clay on the inside of the box, squish some more clay flat, cut that into little pieces, squish those pieces onto the first pieces, and do that a few times until it looks vaguely like a video game screen. Then I'll use some silicone tools and some carving tools to add a little bit of wear and tear because it adds visual interest. And it'll be more fun to paint if I get to add extra texture. After a quick trip through the oven, we'll be ready for some more hardware, but first, it needs feet. The first feet were too big, so I made smaller feet. And of course, the feet need toes. I did not realize how hard it would be to sculpt toes, because I've never sculpted toes before. But the video game has feet, of course. The first part of the inside was ready to go through the oven. I marked out where the hinge would go, and then baked it. And of course, it's time to drill holes in things, which is terrifying. I wrapped a piece of masking tape around the drill bit to help me not drill all the way through the box, which would be distressing, and then pre-drilled the holes so the wood doesn't crack. Of course, we need a clasp on the front to keep it closed, and because I don't want the back of the hinge to damage the glass, I'm using my trusty, very handy roll of masking tape. Then I'm going to realize that the clay I carved out wasn't the right size, so that needs just a little bit of adjustment. Then I added the clasp to the front, and it is time to start building the exterior of our video game. Sort of, in a minute. Well, I guess this is partially exterior, partially interior. I wanted there to be a light on the inside of the video game. Because this LED is taller than the width of the outside of our video game, it's going to stick out a little bit on the top. So I drilled a bunch of holes in increasingly large sizes, and then my largest drill bit didn't work, and so we performed a little bit of additional sculpting with an X-Acto knife, but then that's how it looks in the end. And it needs a cover, so it's not just like sitting there randomly looking weird. And so I tried out a bunch of different things. It turns out those little hinges need a lot of force to open and close, and I was worried it would break the clay. So I took a little piece of a tin can and I made a lid that will open and close on a screw. And then, of course, that needed a little bit of a base so that the screw had something to fit into. And I added some texture to that, and once that's all done with its texture and it opens and closes, it is time to work on the actual front and back of the video game. Now, normally you wouldn't have controls, I don't think, on the front and back of the video game because it would be kind of hard to use. You wouldn't be able to see half of the controls, but we're not going to worry about that. We're going to assume that the Syndicate might not make a particularly user-friendly video game because it's not like the dungeon is particularly user-friendly. So what I did is I took this soda can and I cut it up into little pieces, and initially I was going to cut up those tiny pieces and then poke holes in them and use them as washers, and then put clay on top of the washers so that the base of, well, I guess the head, technically, of a screw would fit. But then I realized that was going to be a nightmare, so I reevaluated, and then I used these bigger pieces, and you can see all of the tiny little screws sticking through because I'm going to put knobs on the ends of those, and then the bases will be free to move but trapped by the soda can. And I know that it works because I am recording this voiceover after the fact, but you get to find out whether or not it works along with me as I film the video. So I covered that with clay, and then of course I wanted the outside of the video game to look kind of like some sort of combination of a medieval Fallout, Jumanji, steampunk monstrosity, because the dungeon has kind of a medieval aesthetic for a lot of the infrastructure, and a video game of the apocalypse needs to feel suitably apocalyptic. And so once I had the rough shape of the screen, I pre-baked the knobs and then drilled holes in them because that turned out to kind of be the easiest way. And then I made sure that they fit on the ends of the screws, and you could still move all of the knobs once they were all next to each other. And then, of course, we did the same thing on the back, where I wanted some slider knobs and some twisty knobs because variety is the spice of life, and I wanted to see if I could make both kinds. So I am once again super gluing my piece of tin can full of screws to the other side of this, and then I realized that I glued it on without all the screws in place, so we had to fix that and re-glue it. But once it's covered in clay, you'll never know that that was a 2-part process that was supposed to be a 1-part process. So once I was done with that, I sculpted all of the buttons, knobs, and bits and pieces. I really wanted to figure out how to make those buttons move, but I realized that that was just going to be a little bit too hard. So it of course needs a little logo, and that's what we're making here. We'll paint it on later, but that's what's going to go there. And then you can see in the middle, that big arch is eventually going to be a view counter, and I'm so excited because you'll be able to move the knob to move the little view counter. But it's not time for that just yet. We're done with the sculpting on the front and the back, and then I realized that the top and the sides were looking not suitably interesting, and so I squished some extra pieces of clay onto the outside edges and then added these little balls so it looked like they were riveted on, and it was really lovely not having to worry about whether or not the edges were super smooth, because nothing built by the syndicate is going to be like super awesome and have really high quality manufacturing standards. So this is what the outside looked like, and then after I fixed the bits that I squished, I put it back through the oven again. And then once that was baked, it's time to add the knobs. But before I did that, it occurred to me I should make sure that my various applications of superglue and bacon bond did not superglue and bacon bond the ends of the screws to the wood. And some of them did, but the pliers fixed that problem. And so then it was on to attaching all of the pre-baked knobs, and then onto the view counter. And I wanted a piece of glass, but I lacked the technical expertise to figure out how to make a piece of glass that shape, so we used a piece of a yogurt lid instead that I cut into that shape. And then I realized that the corners were looking a little bit dull, so I added some extra pieces on the edges there and textured those with the back end of the X-Acto knife. And so here is the finished outside, and then we're ready to sculpt. Oh dear. Now I'm adjusting the outside, which was finished, and then I realized that you couldn't open it, and so we fixed that. And then now you can open it. And before we add paint, we need to finish the clay part on the inside, because I don't think you're supposed to bake the paint. So I added a really thin layer of clay all over the inside, and then the first floor of the dungeon is described as having a brick interior for parts of it at least, and kind of just an overall medieval sort of vibe, technologically at least. And so I pre-baked these columns and then cut them all to size, and then cut them to a more accurate size. Measure twice, cut, I don't know, probably 4 or 5 times. I cut out a bunch of the extra mishaps in the middle there. I attached those with some cosplay, and then of course, magical transition, there's the other columns. And then I realized those were looking a little bit dull and they needed those cool curved supports, because the world dungeon needs to make sense architecturally, otherwise it won't be believable. So there's the curved supports, and I think it looks so cool with those. And then I want to add 2 doors, because we can. And I'm going to make those doors out of paper, because I think that'll hold up better than clay, maybe. And we're going to use ribbon for the hinge. And I did make a clay door, so we're going to try one of each to satisfy my curiosity and see which one holds up better in the oven. I used super glue to attach our ribbon hinges to the doors, and I saturated the ribbon with super glue so that it would be kind of stiff and a little easier to work with later. And then I took this little pre-baked piece of clay and used it to cut out pieces that we're going to use for a door frame. And then I unattached the column we so carefully attached earlier and stuck the ribbon hinge behind it. And look, they open and close. I'm curious to see how they'll hold up in the oven. Well, I'm not now recording this. I know that they held up well, but now it's time to give the whole thing ye olde landlord special, because of course the dungeon would give things the landlord special, and I even painted the hinges because they're easy to clean up later. And then I mixed up this lovely green color and added it to our video game, and then realized I hated the green color, remixed up a new, better, more improved green color. And then I wanted to add some red, because green and red, I'm told, are complementary colors, and that way it would look cool. And I wanted it to be kind of bronze, but not all the way shiny, because I feel like the syndicate would use fake bronze. And so I wanted all the buttons to be red, mostly so that everything would kind of match, because there's a lot of other stuff going on, so we didn't need a lot of button colors to go with it. And I do think this video game would be really hard to play with half the controls on the front and half the controls on the back, but we're going to leave it that way because I kind of like it. And I don't know what we would do about it at this point. And then, of course, it was time to paint the screen. I've been waiting for this the whole time. So, the front screen is that like character loading screen that's at the beginning of a video game where you get to adjust their stats and stuff. So you have Carl on the left and Donut on the right, of course, and then my cat on the screen because he has to be involved in everything. And then Carl's little boxers with little red hearts on them. And this was so much easier when I was sketching it on the iPad because you could zoom in. It was a lot smaller in real life than I had thought when I was making the sketch, but we persevered. And this part I was like, okay, we've got this. And then it came time to do the lettering, and the letters were really, really, really small. But we got there. We did it. We added all the lettering, and I think most of it's pretty legible, hopefully, maybe. But that's the loading screen just about done. And then, of course, we had to paint the back, which you can't see from the front, which is why the video game would be very difficult to play. But that's for the video game players to worry about. Then I painted the view counter, and I added a little screen, kind of like one of those submarine radar monitoring things. I don't know what you would be monitoring, but I wanted one of those fun screens. And of course, Carl always talks about his view counter being like spiked all the way to the right or all the way to the red. And so we added a little bit of a red bit at the end for his view counter to be spiked. And then I always panic when I'm painting lettering that I haven't sketched out first, that I'm going to be paying too much attention to getting all the lines straight and then get the words wrong. But I think I did spell view counter correctly. And then we have the radar sonar screen monitoring. I have no idea what. Something though, for sure. And then I made the little needle on the view counter out of another piece of our soda bottle. And then our handy yogurt lid came back, and I realized the pieces didn't line up very well. So we are fixing that problem with some hard molding paste. I always thought that was modeling paste. I don't know why it's called molding paste. I feel like that's maybe not ideal, but we're adjusting the piece that goes on top of our yogurt lid because I realized that you can't spin the handle with it in place, but nothing a little X-Acto knife can't fix. Then I had to repaint the parts that we fixed. So we had to refix our fix, which is always a distressing thing, but it turned out really cool, so we'll leave it be. And then you can see that the view counter moves. I love it when a project turns out the way you think it will. It can be fun when they don't, and then you get to figure out why it didn't, but it is very nice when projects turn out the way you want them to. And then after that, it was time to paint the interior, and I wanted it to look kind of pretty, even though I realized the dungeon probably isn't all that pretty. But we added a bunch of moss using this fiber paste, which I was really not super sure about, but it dried great. And then behind this first door is a bunch of baby goblins, and they're gonna have beautiful, long, and fulfilling lives. And then here's the guild entrance, and so I added the word guild so that Carl and Donut know where they're running to, and then we added a baby Mordecai. But then we need Carl and Donut and a lava llama to decorate the interior of our video game. And I'm making them out of papers so that I don't have to model them out of clay because that's too small to model things out of clay, and I'm used to working with paper, and it, to me, is much more manageable than clay. So once I cut out the lava llama, it was time to paint him. I was so confused when we first listened to that part of the book because we had just brought our baby home from the hospital, and I was so sleep deprived. And I was like, there's no way that's actually what they said in the book, and it is. And so here's the lava that the llama shoots, and then the baby goblins need eyes so that they can watch their long, happy lives unfold. And then there's Mordecai, of course, in the guild. And then I used a little bit more of the molding paste to attach the lava llama. And then the back of the lava has a little piece of wire, and I attached that to the post in the back of the diorama. And then, of course, Carl and Donut, so tiny, they also got attached with a little bit of molding paste, and then I very patiently let that dry. Well, not all that patiently. I put it outside on a hot day so it would dry faster. But it did dry, and then I painted that the same moss color, and here's our LED, and then you can see it lights up the inside of the video game, and there's Carl and Donut running towards the guild, and Carl has something explosive. And then, of course, it's time for the varnish, which is always a very satisfying and fun part of the process, partially because you're done, and partially because it makes things shiny and it makes it look so finished and neat. So I used a satin varnish to go over the whole thing to protect the surface and make it shiny and fun. And because everything was painted with acrylic wash, nothing will bleed and it'll just be all shiny. Well, sort of shiny. I saved the shiny varnish for the screens, so this blue one and then the main screen on the front, to hopefully add a little bit of contrast. It ended up looking pretty similar front versus back, but that's okay. It still looks cool with varnish on it. Varnish will take a couple of days to dry fully, which is always the hardest part of any project because then you can't touch it or mess with it because you'll leave fingerprints in the varnish. But a few days later, via magical transition, here is the finished piece. And I love how it turned out. I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the process for how it came together. I love how the view counter on the back turned out and that all of the knobs move and work. And even with the varnish, they still didn't all glue shut into whatever position they were in, which is great. And there's the view counter spiked all the way to the right. Poor Carl, something bad's about to happen. And then when we open up the video game, there's Carl and Donut. And of course the lava llama and the lava llama's lava. And the tiny little door with all of the goblins who will lead happy, long, and fulfilling lives, and nothing bad will happen to all those baby goblins. And then we move on to the other side of the video game, and there's Carl and Donut, so very tiny. It's a little hard to see Donut with the column behind her. They're too similar in color, but you can still kind of tell that that's what she is. Then there's Mordecai over in the corner, and that is how I think it might look if Dungeon Crawler Carl was a video game. Thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and you can follow along on Instagram or Patreon.